Ladies and gentlemen, friends, comrades, we are living through a moment in history that will not be forgotten. A collapse is unfolding before our very eyes, an economic, social, and political unraveling that will define not just the present, but the very identity of an entire generation. This collapse is not sudden. It is not a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. It is the inevitable consequence of decades of decisions made by those who valued profit over people, power over democracy, and short-term gain over long-term stability. The collapse we are witnessing today is not a sudden event that arrived out of nowhere, nor is it a temporary setback that will be easily reversed. It is the culmination of long-term systemic contradictions within capitalism itself, and understanding this inevitability is crucial to grasping why today's crisis feels so different, so enduring, and so deeply transformative. For decades, the system has operated on a foundation of profit maximization above all else, which has consistently undermined the stability of society. The pursuit of higher profits has meant cutting wages, outsourcing jobs, stripping away protections for workers, and reducing investment in public goods like education, healthcare, and housing. These decisions may have boosted corporate earnings in the short term, but over time they hollowed out the very society on which the economy depends. What we are living through today is not a series of isolated accidents, but the predictable outcome of an economic structure that prioritizes capital over people. We can see this inevitability most clearly when we examine the widening gap between the rich and everyone else. Over the last half-century, productivity has soared, while wages for ordinary workers have stagnated. The wealth created by technological innovation and global trade did not flow to the majority, but was captured overwhelmingly by the top 1%. This massive concentration of wealth has destabilized societies worldwide, eroding the middle class and fueling resentment and despair. At the same time, the system became increasingly reliant on debt to sustain consumer demand. People could not afford the rising costs of housing, healthcare, or education on stagnant wages, so they borrowed. Families accumulated credit card debt. Students took out massive loans. Governments propped up economies with deficit spending, and corporations loaded themselves with cheap credit. All of this created a fragile house of cards that only needed a shock, like the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic, to begin collapsing. Another factor proving the inevitability of this collapse is the reckless exploitation of natural resources. Capitalism's relentless drive for growth ignores ecological limits, treating the planet as an endless pool of raw materials and a bottomless trash bin for waste. The climate crisis is not separate from the economic system, but the direct result of its logic. When profits demand short-term extraction, long-term sustainability is sacrificed. As climate disasters become more frequent and devastating, they intersect with economic fragility, compounding the crisis. Wildfires, floods, and heat waves disrupt supply chains, displace millions, and burden governments with costs they cannot bear. The collapse, therefore, is both economic and environmental, a convergence of crises that were foreseen by many but ignored by those in power. Political decisions have further cemented this trajectory. Deregulation in finance allowed speculation and bubbles to run wild. Trade policies favored corporations over workers. Tax cuts enriched the wealthy while starving public institutions. Safety nets were dismantled in the name of efficiency, leaving societies unprepared for shocks. Each of these policies was presented as rational, as necessary, as inevitable within the logic of capitalism. And yet, taken together, they have left economies brittle, societies divided, and politics poisoned by mistrust and polarization. When millions of people lose faith in the system, when they no longer believe that hard work will provide security, when they see elites growing richer while they struggle, collapse becomes not only likely but unavoidable. What is crucial to emphasize is that this collapse was not an accident and not the result of individual failings. It is the systemic outcome of rules designed to protect profit above all else. Just as the Great Depression was not an unexpected misfortune, but the result of unregulated markets, speculation, and inequality, so too today's collapse is the predictable endgame of neoliberal capitalism. The system has reached a point where its contradictions can no longer be papered over with credit, propaganda, or minor reforms. The facade is cracking, and a generation is waking up to the reality that they were handed a broken system from the start. If we call this collapse inevitable, it is not to induce despair, but to demand clarity. For decades, people were told that crises were temporary blips, that markets would correct themselves, that prosperity would eventually trickle down. These promises have proven false. The inevitability of collapse should liberate us from false hopes and force us to confront the truth. The system is incapable of reforming itself. Recognizing this is the first step toward building something different, something more humane and sustainable. Collapse was always baked into the system's design, and now that it has arrived, the question is what new system will emerge from its ruins. A generation is being shaped not by prosperity, but by crisis, and this reality will define their outlook for decades to come. Young people today have never truly known stability. Many were children when the 2008 financial crash shattered illusions of endless growth, wiping out jobs, homes, and savings for millions of families. Just as the aftershocks of that collapse lingered, the world was struck by the COVID-19 pandemic, which not only exposed but deepened the inequalities already festering in society. For those now coming of age, crisis is not an exception, but the environment in which they live, study, work, and dream. Their identity, their politics, and their aspirations are being forged in the crucible of systemic failure. Consider what it means for a generation to begin their adult lives burdened with unprecedented student debt, facing job markets dominated by low wages, unstable contracts, and the disappearance of long-term security. Unlike previous generations who could expect a steady career, affordable housing, and upward mobility, today's young people see doors closing rather than opening. Homeownership, once a milestone of adulthood, is out of reach for many. Healthcare is prohibitively expensive. Even higher education, touted as the gateway to opportunity, has become a trap that locks millions into debt without guaranteeing a stable future. The constant pressure of financial precarity shapes not only individual lives, but the collective psychology of a generation that has been taught to expect less than their parents. The shaping force of crisis is not purely economic, it is also cultural and political. Young people are growing up in a world where trust in institutions is collapsing. They see governments captured by corporations, politicians unwilling to act on urgent issues like climate change, and media that too often protects the interests of the powerful rather than speaking truth. This disillusionment is not abstract. It is lived experience. When a pandemic exposes the inability of the richest country on earth to provide basic medical care, when natural disasters devastate communities without adequate response, when wages remain stagnant while billionaires double their wealth, it becomes impossible for a generation to maintain faith in the system that presides over such failure. At the same time, this generation is shaped by constant exposure to global awareness. Through technology and social media, they see the struggles of their peers in other nations. They witness injustice in real time, and they connect their own difficulties to larger systemic patterns. This awareness fuels both despair and determination. Despair because the scale of the crisis is overwhelming. Determination because they see that they are not alone in facing it. A shared sense of injustice becomes a generational experience, knitting together millions who realize they have more in common with each other than with the elites who govern them. Crisis also alters the values of a generation. Instead of measuring success by individual achievement within the system, many begin to question the system itself. They ask whether endless consumption is sustainable, whether growth at any cost is desirable, whether democracy can coexist with massive corporate power. This questioning is not an intellectual exercise. It is born of necessity. When survival itself is uncertain, when the future feels stolen, people begin to search for alternatives. They look to cooperative models, to movements for climate justice, to labor organizing, and to radical visions of equality. In this sense, the collapse does not merely crush a generation, it also pushes them toward reimagining what society could and should be. The weight of crisis leaves scars, but it also forges resilience. A generation shaped by repeated betrayals learns not to take promises at face value. They develop skepticism toward authority and an instinct for solidarity with one another. These qualities will define how they respond to future challenges. Just as the Great Depression shaped a generation that demanded unions and social security, today's crises are shaping a generation that will demand systemic transformation. They will not forget that the system failed them at every critical juncture and that memory will guide their politics and their choices. In the end, a generation is always defined by the conditions of its youth. For today's young people, those conditions are marked by instability, inequality, and the collapse of trust in old institutions. But within this collapse lies the seed of transformation. Being shaped by crisis means being prepared to challenge the status quo, to see beyond the lies of inevitability, and to fight for a different future. The forces that have denied them stability may have also given them something far more powerful: the determination to build a society that does not repeat the failures they have been forced to endure. The collapse of trust in institutions is one of the most profound aspects of the current crisis, and it will have consequences that last for generations. Institutions are meant to provide stability, to reassure people that society is governed fairly, that the rules apply equally, and that collective problems can be solved through established channels. For much of modern history, governments, corporations, schools, media, and religious bodies played this role. They were not perfect, but they held a certain legitimacy in the eyes of the public. Today, however, that legitimacy is crumbling. The very institutions people once relied on are now seen as corrupt, ineffective, or outright hostile to their interests. This erosion of trust is not accidental. It is the direct result of repeated failures that have left ordinary people feeling betrayed. Governments across the world, especially in advanced capitalist nations, have shown themselves incapable of meeting the needs of their populations. In the United States, for example, Congress bailed out banks after the 2008 crash, while millions of families lost their homes. During the pandemic, Billions were funneled to large corporations while essential workers were forced into unsafe conditions with inadequate protections. Politicians promised relief, fairness, and recovery, but what people witnessed was favoritism for the wealthy and neglect for the majority. When such failures are repeated again and again, citizens lose faith that government exists to serve them. Instead, they begin to see it as an arm of corporate power, a system designed to preserve the privileges of the elite. The media, too, has suffered a crisis of credibility. Once regarded as the watchdog of democracy, it is now widely perceived as another institution captured by wealth and partisanship. News outlets owned by billionaires or giant corporations rarely challenge the structures that produce inequality, preferring instead to focus on spectacle or shallow narratives. Younger generations raised in a digital environment quickly notice this bias. They see how stories of corruption or systemic injustice are minimized while celebrity gossip dominates headlines. They recognize the way media outlets manipulate public opinion to align with political or corporate agendas. As a result, many turn to alternative sources, to independent journalism or grassroots platforms, but these too are fragmented and often unreliable. The decline of trust in media reflects a broader sense that traditional institutions are incapable of telling the truth about the world. Corporations, meanwhile, are openly distrusted. Decades ago, they presented themselves as providers of jobs, security, and innovation. Today, they are more often associated with exploitation, pollution, and greed. Workers see themselves treated as disposable, paid wages that do not keep up with the cost of living, while executives enjoy astronomical salaries. Communities experience environmental destruction caused by industries that prioritize profits over human health. Consumers face rising prices, planned obsolescence, and monopolistic practices. The idea that corporations are socially responsible actors has collapsed under the weight of lived experience. People see through the slogans and marketing campaigns. They understand that corporations are structured to serve shareholders, not society. Even education and religion, two of the most enduring institutions, have lost some of their moral authority. Schools and universities, once considered ladders of opportunity, are now associated with crushing debt and unequal access. Many students feel cheated, promised a future that never materializes despite years of study and financial sacrifice. Religious institutions, too, have been rocked by scandals and hypocrisy, eroding their ability to provide moral guidance. The combined effect of these disillusionments is that younger generations no longer take institutions at their word. They approach them with suspicion, if not outright hostility. This collapse of trust carries both dangers and possibilities. The danger lies in the vacuum it creates. When people no longer believe in traditional institutions, they become vulnerable to manipulation by demagogues who promise simple solutions, often by scapegoating vulnerable groups. Polarization intensifies, conspiracy theories spread, and authoritarian movements gain traction. Yet, at the same time, the collapse of trust opens the door for new forms of organization. People turn to grassroots activism, mutual aid networks, and worker cooperatives. They begin to imagine alternatives outside the traditional framework. The very failure of institutions can become the catalyst for innovation and democratic experimentation. What must be understood is that trust cannot be restored with slogans or surface-level reforms. It requires structural change. People will only believe in institutions again when they see them genuinely serve the public good rather than private profit. Until that happens, the collapse of trust will continue to deepen, shaping how a generation views authority, legitimacy, and the possibility of change. The loss of faith in institutions is not just a symptom of collapse, it is one of its most defining features, ensuring that this era will be remembered as the time when the old pillars of society crumbled and new possibilities began to emerge. Collapse is never a simple story of destruction. It is always a dual phenomenon carrying both grave dangers and unprecedented opportunities. When societies unravel, when economic systems falter, and when trust in institutions evaporates, the results can be devastating. History offers countless examples of collapse, leading to suffering, authoritarianism, and violence. Yet history also teaches that collapse clears the ground for new ways of living, new social arrangements, and transformations that once seemed impossible. The dual nature of collapse lies in this paradox. The very conditions that make life unbearable also create the urgency to reimagine what life could be. The dangers are real and should not be underestimated. Economic collapse breeds insecurity, and insecurity often fuels fear. Fear, in turn, becomes fertile ground for demagogues and opportunists who offer easy answers. They point fingers at scapegoats, immigrants, minorities, dissenters, and promise to restore order by crushing them. This is how collapse can give rise to fascism, authoritarian regimes, and brutal repression. The 1930s provide a vivid reminder. The same Great Depression that pushed some countries towards social welfare policies also enabled others to descend into fascism and war. When people are desperate, they may cling to the first voice that offers certainty, even if that certainty comes at the expense of freedom, justice, and humanity. The danger, then, is not only the collapse of an old system, but the possibility that something even worse could replace it. Yet, within collapse also lies opportunity. Cracks in the old order expose the weaknesses and contradictions that had long been hidden. When people see that the so-called normal system cannot meet their needs, they begin to question its legitimacy. This questioning is powerful. It opens the door to radical imagination, to visions of society organized differently. Workers begin to consider collective ownership. Communities turn to cooperation and mutual aid. Movements for climate justice, racial justice, and economic democracy gain momentum because the failure of the existing order makes clear that alternatives are necessary. In times of collapse, ideas that once seemed utopian become matters of survival. The opportunity of collapse is also psychological. People who once felt isolated in their struggles realize that millions of others share their plight. This recognition fosters solidarity. When wages fall, rents rise, and debts accumulate, the shared experience of hardship creates fertile ground for collective action. The duality here is striking. Where collapse isolates individuals through fear, it also unites them through common suffering. Out of this unity can emerge mass movements capable of reshaping societies. The labor uprisings of the early 20th century, the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, and the wave of anti-colonial movements after World War II all illustrate how collapse and crisis can produce profound liberation. Another opportunity lies in the urgency collapse creates. In stable times, societies often resist change, clinging to traditions and institutions even when they no longer serve the majority. But collapse removes that luxury. When the system can no longer provide, When survival is threatened, the need for new solutions becomes immediate. Climate change, for instance, is pushing societies toward recognizing that endless growth and fossil fuel dependence are unsustainable. Economic collapse forces reconsideration of housing as a right rather than a commodity. Political collapse demands experiments in direct democracy and grassroots governance. Collapse compels what comfort rarely allows, bold innovation. Still, the outcome is not predetermined. The dual nature of collapse means it can swing in either direction, toward authoritarian control or toward democratic renewal. Which path is taken depends on how people respond. If fear dominates, if society fragments into suspicion and hatred, collapse will likely lead to repression. But if solidarity grows stronger than fear, if movements channel despair into collective action, then collapse becomes the beginning of transformation. It is this tension between danger and opportunity that defines our present moment. Recognizing the duality is crucial. To see only the danger is to sink into despair. To see only the opportunity is to fall into naive optimism. The truth lies in the balance. Collapse is both a threat to be resisted and a chance to be seized. For today's generation, this means the stakes are enormous. They must navigate the fear, resist the demagogues, and channel their anger and disillusionment into building something better. The collapse is inevitable, but what comes after remains unwritten. The danger is real, but so too is the opportunity to build a more just, humane, and sustainable world from the ruins of the old one. Every generation faces a defining choice, a crossroads where history demands a decision about the future. For today's generation, that choice is stark: submission or transformation. Collapse is not an abstract concept for them. It is the reality they are living. The system they inherited has already proven incapable of providing security, equality, or sustainability. They can either accept this collapse as their fate, resigning themselves to precarity and diminished expectations, or they can seize the moment to demand a fundamental transformation of society. This is the defining struggle of our time, and it will shape not only the trajectory of this generation, but also the course of history itself. Submission is the path of despair. It means internalizing the idea that there is no alternative, that the only option is to endure whatever hardships the system imposes. Submission manifests when young people believe they must work 3 jobs just to survive, that student debt is a normal burden, that unaffordable housing is inevitable, and that climate disasters are just part of life. It is the quiet acceptance of injustice as a natural order, the belief that individual sacrifice is the only way to cope with systemic failure. Submission allows the powerful to maintain their dominance because it directs anger inward rather than outward. Instead of questioning the system, people blame themselves for not working hard enough, not saving enough, or not being smart enough to succeed. This path ensures that collapse will not only continue but deepen. Transformation, on the other hand, begins with the recognition that collapse is not personal failure but systemic failure. It means understanding that individuals are not to blame for structural inequality, that the problem lies not in the laziness of workers, but in the priorities of capitalism itself. Transformation requires courage because it asks people to step outside the narrative they have been taught and imagine something radically different. It demands collective action because no individual can change the system alone. When workers unionize, when communities organize for housing rights, when students resist crushing debt, when climate activists demand systemic change, they are choosing transformation over submission. This choice is not made in isolation. It is shaped by the examples set by earlier generations. The Great Depression generation chose transformation by fighting for unions, social security, and public programs. The Civil Rights generation chose transformation by challenging segregation and injustice. In contrast, periods of submission in history often allowed elites to consolidate power, deepen inequality, and prolong suffering. Today's generation faces a similar test. They can either accept a world where billionaires hoard wealth while millions struggle to survive, or they can insist on redistribution, democratic control of resources, and policies that prioritize human needs over profit. Transformation also requires vision. It is not enough to resist collapse. People must articulate what they want to build in its place. This could mean universal health care, affordable housing, green energy, and worker-owned enterprises. It could mean dismantling systems of racial and gender oppression that have been embedded in the economy for centuries. It could mean building a global solidarity that recognizes the interconnectedness of struggles across borders. Transformation asks, if the old system is collapsing, what new system should rise from its ashes? It challenges the fatalism of submission with the hope of creation. Yet the path to transformation is difficult. It faces resistance from those who benefit from submission. Corporations, political elites, and entrenched institutions will fight to preserve their privileges. They will use fear, propaganda, and repression to discourage change. This is why submission often feels easier. It avoids confrontation. But history shows that transformation, though harder, is the only way societies move forward. It is the only way collapse becomes a moment of rebirth rather than permanent decline. Ultimately, the choice between submission and transformation is not abstract. It is lived daily in countless small and large acts. Every strike, every protest, every demand for justice is a rejection of submission and an embrace of transformation. Every time people refuse to normalize inequality, they are choosing to fight for a different future. The stakes could not be higher. If this generation submits, collapse will harden into permanent crisis. If they transform, collapse will become the soil from which a new and more just society grows. The decision belongs to them, but its consequences will belong to all of us.